The sun beat down on the cracked earth of the Arizona Territory, a relentless fire in a sky the color of bleached denim. Elias, a man whose age was etched in the deep lines around his eyes and the permanent stoop in his shoulders, moved with the slow, deliberate grace of someone who had long ago made peace with solitude. His ranch, a cluster of sun-faded wood and dust, was a monument to his quiet, post-war life. The air was still, thick with the scent of dry sagebrush and distant silent thunder. For 5 years he had lived like this, his only companions the ghost-like dust devils that danced across his land, and the memories that haunted his waking hours. Elias was a man of the land now, but his hands, calloused from years of gripping reins and rifles, remembered a different life. He had served in the cavalry, a life of duty and death under the command of Captain Miller, a man he respected more than any other. The war had ended, but its echoes lingered in the sharp, sudden pains in his leg and the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon. He was at a crossroads, his meager crop of sorghum struggling against the drought, his spirits as dry as the land he worked. He knew with a certainty that gnawed at his gut that a bad harvest meant he would have to sell his last remaining mule, a beast of burden he had come to depend on. He was mending a split rail in the fence line, the rhythmic strike of his hammer a small, defiant sound against the vast silence. It was then he saw it, a shape on the horizon, too large and too fast to be a coyote, but moving with the same desperate, low-to-the-ground gait. As it drew closer, Elias's heart clenched. It was a horse, but not just any horse. Its coat, a once proud roan, was matted and stained with dried mud and blood. Its ribs showed through its skin like a skeletal cage, and its head hung low, its breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The horse, a magnificent half-thoroughbred, was a war-horse, and it was dying. Elias dropped his hammer, a loud clang that seemed to shatter the stillness. He had seen this look before. In the eyes of men on the battlefield, the vacant, tired look of a soul giving up. He watched the horse falter, its legs trembling before it finally collapsed in a heap of exhausted bone and muscle. Elias ran, his old joints protesting with every step. He knelt beside the animal, his hand hesitating before gently touching its neck. The horse flinched, a spasm of pain and fear, but didn't fight. Elias saw the brand, a telltale mark of the Union Army, and the old soldier in him recognized it. This horse had served, and it had been abandoned. He went back to the ranch house and returned with a bucket of water and a handful of oats, the last of his winter store. The horse drank deeply, its throat working with an almost desperate gratitude. Elias sat with the animal, shooing away the flies that swarmed its wounds. He cleaned the cuts with a clean rag and some whiskey, the horse whinnying in pain but standing still. For the rest of the day, Elias tended to the horse, his old skills returning to him as if they had never left. He built a makeshift shelter, providing what little shade he could, and brought out his old army blanket to cover the shivering animal. As dusk settled, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple, Elias watched the horse slowly chew on a handful of his precious sorghum. The animal's eyes, once full of a vacant despair, now held a flicker of life, a spark of trust. Elias felt a profound sense of purpose he hadn't known since he had left the war. The horse wasn't just an animal, it was a comrade, a fellow survivor. He named him Whiskey, for the liquid that had both numbed his old pain and helped him tend to the horse's new wounds. That night, as the stars began to pepper the vast, empty canvas of the sky, Elias sat by Whiskey's side, the two of them a small, defiant island of life in the quiet, merciless desert. He didn't know it yet, but his simple act of kindness was about to set off a chain of events that would change his life, and the lives of many others, forever. Word travels fast in the desolate stretches of the West, carried by the wind and whispered from one lone traveler to the next. The news of a lone rancher caring for a warhorse reached the ears of Ben, a man whose ambition was as ruthless as the land itself. Ben was a scavenger, a leader of a small gang of disgruntled ex-Confederate soldiers who now made their living through petty theft and intimidation. He was a man with a chip on his shoulder the size of a mountain, convinced the world had cheated him. To Ben, the war was not just a conflict, it was a personal humiliation, and the sight of a Union warhorse was like a red flag to a bull. Ben's gang consisted of a motley crew: Jeb, a lanky, nervous man who followed Ben's every command out of fear, Silas, a brute with a face scarred from a gunpowder burn, and two younger brothers, Cole and Jed, who were more eager to prove their worth than to think for themselves. They were gathered around a smoky campfire, their faces lit by the flickering flames, when Jeb brought up the rumor. "Heard tell of an old rancher, a Union man, found a war horse," Jeb said, his voice a low mumble. "Taking care of it like it was his own." Ben's eyes narrowed, a cold glint appearing in them. "A Union horse?" he sneered, spitting into the fire. "Left to rot, just like they left us. It's a disgrace. That horse ain't worth nothing but its hide, and that hide belongs to us." He saw an opportunity not just for profit, but for a twisted kind of revenge. The Union had won the war, but he would take a piece of their legacy, a living symbol of their victory, and turn it into something useful. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Elias was spending his days and nights nursing whiskey back to health. He used his meager savings to buy feed from a traveling merchant, sacrificing his own needs for the animal. He spoke to the horse in low tones, telling it stories of his time in the war, of Captain Miller and the men he had known. Whiskey, in turn, began to respond, its ears twitching at the sound of Elias's voice, its head nudging his hand for a gentle scratch. The bond between them grew, a silent, powerful connection forged in shared hardship and a quiet understanding of each other's pain. One morning, while Elias was mending a different part of his fence, he saw a cloud of dust on the horizon. His old soldier's instinct kicked in. It was a group of riders, too many to be friendly travelers. He hurried back to the ranch, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. He led Whiskey into the small, rickety barn, whispering reassurances to the horse. "It's all right, boy, we'll be all right." The riders dismounted, their faces grim and set. Ben, a tall man with a permanent scowl, dismounted last, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Elias stepped out of the barn, his gaze fixed on them. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Heard you got something of ours, old man," Ben said, his voice dripping with venom. "A horse, a Union horse. We're here to collect." "This horse ain't yours," Elias said, his shoulders squaring. "It was abandoned. I found it. It's my horse now." A laugh, humorless and sharp, escaped Ben's lips. "Abandoned? He's worthless, old man. Worthless and a disgrace. We're going to take him, and we're going to sell his hide for what we can get. Better you give him up now, save us all some trouble." Elias stood his ground. He had faced down bullets and bayonets, and he would not back down from this. "This horse fought for its life, just like I did. I won't let you hurt him. You'll have to go through me." The words hung in the air, a final challenge. Ben's face darkened, his eyes narrowing to slits. The sound of the wind rustling through the dry grass was the only sound for a long moment. Then with a snarl, Ben gave a nod to his men. "Get him!" The gang surged forward, a whirlwind of fists and fury. Elias, despite his age, put up a fight, but he was no match for four younger, stronger men. He was struck repeatedly, blows raining down on his head and body. He fell to the ground, trying to cover his head, as kicks landed on his ribs. Through the haze of pain, he could hear the sound of the barn door being forced open, the panicked whinny of Whiskey. He heard the men leading the horse away, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance. His last conscious thought was of the horse, his heart sinking with a terrible, helpless sorrow. He was left in the dust, a broken, bleeding man, with nothing but the vast, empty sky above him. The sun was high in the sky when the traveling doctor, a woman named Eliza, found Elias. She was on her way to a remote homestead to deliver a baby, her wagon creaking under the weight of her medical supplies. She had a reputation for being quiet and efficient, a woman who could mend a broken bone as easily as she could deliver a child. She saw the figure lying motionless in the dust and, with a heavy sigh, pulled her wagon to a stop. She knelt beside him, her face a mask of professional calm. Elias was a mess of cuts and bruises, his face swollen and his breathing shallow. She gently felt his ribs, her fingers detecting the unmistakable crack of a fracture. His head was bleeding from a deep gash, and his eyes, when he finally opened them, were clouded with pain and a deep, crushing defeat. "You're alive," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Let's keep it that way." She helped him into her wagon, a difficult and painful process. He was a heavy man, and his body was a dead weight. Once he was settled among her blankets and supplies, she tended to his wounds, cleaning them meticulously with carbolic acid and stitching the worst of the gashes. Elias remained mostly silent, his teeth clenched against the pain, his mind replaying the image of whiskey being led away. As she worked, she asked him what had happened. Elias, his voice a low, raspy whisper, told her about the horse and the men who had taken it. He spoke of Ben with a quiet, burning hatred. Eliza listened, her expression unreadable. She had seen the cruelty of men before, but this story, of a man being beaten for an act of kindness, struck a particularly cold chord. "They took him," Elias whispered, the words a raw wound in the air. "My horse." "You'll get him back," Eliza said, though she had no real reason to believe it. "First, you need to heal." She drove him to her own small cabin, a simple log structure nestled in a sheltered valley a few miles from his ranch. It was a place of quiet solitude, a sanctuary from the harshness of the outside world. She had herbs and remedies she had collected and cultivated, a small garden where she grew medicinal plants. It was her own little piece of the world, and it was here that she would care for Elias. Over the next few days, Elias slowly began to mend. Eliza's care was tireless and thorough. She fed him broths, changed his dressings, and sat with him, her presence a silent comfort. She didn't press him for more details, allowing him to heal in his own time. Elias, in turn, watched her, a quiet gratitude in his eyes. He saw the strength in her hands, the determination in her movements. He began to see her not just as a doctor, but as a fellow survivor in a world that didn't give much for free. He found himself telling her more about whiskey, about the horse's wounds, its spirit, and the bond they had formed. He spoke of his own past in the cavalry, the men he had served with, and his old commander, Captain Miller. Elias's voice, once so full of a heavy burden of silence, began to lighten as he shared his stories. Eliza listened, a quiet curiosity in her eyes. She saw the man behind the pain, a man of honor and duty, a man who had been broken but not destroyed. She knew that healing his physical wounds was only part of her job. She had to help him find the will to fight again, to believe that what he had lost could be found. One afternoon, as she was changing his bandages, Elias looked at her, his expression resolute. "I have to get him back," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "I won't just let them get away with it." "You can't go after them alone," Eliza said, her tone practical. "You're still too weak." "I have friends," Elias said, a faint smile on his lips. "An old friend, a captain. He'll help me. I know he will." Eliza looked at him, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "Good," she said, her voice filled with quiet approval. "Then we'll get you strong enough to ride. We'll get you ready." The telegram office in the nearest town was a small, dusty shack with a single telegraph machine that hummed and clicked with the lifeblood of the outside world. A young boy from Eliza's homestead, a rider named Billy, was sent to the town. A piece of paper with Elias's shaky handwriting clutched in his hand. The message was short, cryptic, and direct. A message that only an old soldier would understand. Miller. Union horse. Ben. Need you. Elias. Billy handed the message to the telegraph operator, a wizened old man who had seen it all. He read the message, a slow understanding dawning in his eyes. He recognized the name Elias, a man who had come through his town years ago. He knew a thing or two about honor and duty, and he sent the message with a silent prayer that it would find its mark. The telegraph machine in the bustling cavalry outpost clicked to life, a small, insistent beat against the roar of activity. The outpost was a hub of order and discipline, a stark contrast to the untamed wilderness that surrounded it. Captain Miller, a man of quiet authority and sharp, intelligent eyes, was in his office, his head bent over a map, when his sergeant entered with the message. "Sir, a telegram for you," the sergeant said, his voice devoid of emotion. Miller took the paper, his eyes scanning the words. His brow furrowed at the name Elias. He hadn't seen his old friend in years, not since they had parted ways after the war. The words Union horse and Ben hit him with the force of a punch. He knew exactly who Ben was. He was an ex-soldier from an enemy regiment, a man Miller had faced on the battlefield, a man known for his cruelty and his hatred of the Union. And the name Elias was not just a name, it was a call for help. Miller looked at the map, his mind racing. The location, the names. It all pointed to one thing. Elias was in trouble, and it was because of an act of kindness. Miller knew the kind of man Elias was. He was the kind of man who would risk his life to save an animal, the kind of man who would stand up to a bully, even when the odds were stacked against him. He crumpled the paper in his hand, a cold fury rising within him. He strode out of his office, his spurs jangling on the wooden floor. His sergeant, a man who had served under him for years, knew the look on his face. It was the look of a man who was about to go to war. "Sergeant," Miller said, his voice low and firm. "Get Corporal Thomas, Private Johnson, and Private Lee. We're riding out." "Sir, a patrol?" the sergeant asked. "No," Miller said, his eyes hard. "A rescue. We're going to find a Union horse, and we're going to get it back." He didn't need to say more. The sergeant understood. This wasn't just a mission, it was personal. It was about loyalty and honor, a debt owed to a man who had stood by him in the darkest of times. The four men were a small but formidable group. Miller was the strategist, the leader who thought 3 steps ahead. Corporal Thomas was the tracker, a man who could read the land like a book. Private Johnson was the marksman, steady and true. Private Lee was the youngest, eager and fiercely loyal. They were not just a patrol, they were a unit, a family forged in the fires of war. As they rode out of the outpost, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the dusty landscape. Miller didn't know what they would find, but he knew one thing for certain. They would find Elias and they would find his horse, and they would make Ben and his gang pay for what they had done. The chase was on, a desperate race against time and the unforgiving wilderness. Miller and his small unit, 4 men against an unknown number of outlaws, followed the trail with a grim determination. Corporal Thomas, a man with a hawk's eye for detail, was at the front, his gaze fixed on the ground. The trail was faint, the hoofprints of whiskey mixed with the heavier tracks of the outlaws' horses. It was a phantom trail, one that seemed to disappear and reappear at random, a testament to the skill of the men they were pursuing. "They're trying to cover their tracks, sir," Thomas said, pointing to a patch of scrub where the hoofprints had been deliberately scuffed out. "They know someone's coming for them." Miller nodded, his jaw set. "They didn't expect us, Thomas. They thought they were dealing with an old man and a defenseless animal. Let's show them they were wrong." They rode for hours, the sun beating down on them, their canteens growing lighter with every sip. The trail led them through treacherous canyons and across dry riverbeds. Miller used his military training to predict where the outlaws would go, anticipating their moves, thinking like an enemy. He knew Ben's mind. It was a mind of a man who took the easy way out, a man who would prioritize a quick getaway over a well-planned escape. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in fiery colors, they found a small abandoned homestead. The door was off its hinges, and the interior was ransacked. Inside they found evidence that the outlaws had been there, a half-eaten can of beans, a discarded whiskey bottle, and, most importantly, a single, loose horseshoe. Thomas knelt, examining the horseshoe with a practiced eye. "This is from the horse, sir," he said, holding it up. "From the roan. It's been here." Miller felt a surge of grim satisfaction. They were on the right path. They were close. But the sight of the ransacked cabin also sent a cold chill down his spine. Ben's gang was not just a group of men stealing a horse. They were a group of violent, lawless scavengers, and there was no telling what else they had done. They made camp near the homestead, keeping a low profile. They ate a cold dinner of hardtack and dried beef, the silence between them filled with a shared sense of purpose. Miller laid out a map, his finger tracing the possible routes Ben's gang could take. He knew they would be heading toward the mountains, a place of cover and concealment, a place where they could lose a pursuing force. "We can cut them off," Miller said, his voice low. "If we ride hard, we can get to the pass before they do." Private Lee, the youngest, spoke up, his voice filled with a youthful eagerness. "You think they'll put up a fight, sir?" "They'll do more than that, son," Miller said, his eyes fixed on the map. "They're cornered animals. They'll be vicious." That night Miller stood watch, his eyes scanning the horizon. He thought of Elias, his old friend, a man who had saved his life more than once in the war. He thought of the horse, a creature of duty and loyalty, a living symbol of a past they both shared. He felt a deep personal stake in this mission, a sense of duty that went beyond military orders. This was about righting a wrong, about proving that honor and decency were not dead in the unforgiving West. As he stood there, the stars a silent, distant audience, he felt a sense of anticipation, a quiet resolve. The next day would be a test of their skills, their courage, and their loyalty. They were a small force, but they were a force of purpose, and they would not stop until they found what they were looking for. Back at Eliza's small, sturdy cabin, the days bled into each other, each one a testament to Elias's slow but steady recovery. The brutal, vivid bruises on his body had begun to fade into a grotesque but beautiful mosaic of purples, blues, and yellows, and the deep, angry gash on his head was healing, a faint, pink scar in the making. But while his body mended, his spirit remained restless. His mind was a constant swirl of worry, guilt, and a simmering anger that refused to dissipate. He wanted to be out there, a part of the search, a part of the action, but he knew with a frustrating certainty that he wasn't ready. He was still too weak, his body a source of constant pain and exhaustion, a frustrating reminder of his helplessness. Eliza, ever the watchful and patient caretaker, saw his restlessness as clearly as if it were a visible wound. She sat with him on the porch, a silent companion, as he stared out at the vast, empty landscape that stretched to the horizon. She knew that he needed to talk, to release the burden of his past that had been building up for years, the unspoken weight of memories he had carried alone. She knew that his obsession with the horse and his reliance on an old friend weren't just about a stolen animal. They were about something much deeper. "Tell me about him," she said softly, her voice a gentle interruption of the silence. "Captain Miller." Elias turned to look at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He hadn't realized how much he had been talking about his old commander, how his thoughts constantly circled back to the man who was his only hope. "He's a good man," Elias said, his voice filled with a deep, unshakable respect that transcended time and distance. "The best I ever knew. He was a natural leader, didn't matter if we were in the middle of a screaming battle or just making camp for the night. He always had a plan, always thought of his men first. He'd walk through hell for his soldiers, and they would do the same for him." He began to tell her stories, tales of close calls and quiet victories. He spoke of the time Miller had single-handedly held off a charge, his rifle a blur of motion, to allow his men to retreat safely, a feat of bravery that had earned him the undying loyalty of every man in his unit. He spoke of the quiet moments, the late-night talks around the campfire, where Miller would listen to his men's fears and hopes, not as a superior officer, but as a fellow human being who understood the profound weight of their service. "He saved my life once," Elias said, his voice a low, raw whisper that held the weight of a memory he had carried for decades. "We were pinned down, and a bullet hit me in the leg. Miller came out, under a storm of fire, and dragged me to safety. He didn't even hesitate. If it wasn't for him, I wouldn't be here. I owe him my life." Eliza listened, her eyes fixed on his. She saw the pain in his expression, the unspoken weight of the memories, the guilt that he had asked this man, who had already given so much, to put his life on the line again. "And the horse?" she asked softly. Is it like a part of that?" Elias nodded, his gaze distant, lost in the past. "That horse, it reminds me of him, of all the men we lost, of the loyalty we had to each other. When I saw it starving and broken, it was like looking at a piece of our history, a piece of me just left to die. I couldn't let that happen. Not to an animal that had served. That had earned a better end." He confessed his deepest fears, the gnawing worry that he might have sent his old friend into a trap, that the call for help might lead to their demise. He spoke of his own helplessness, his inability to fight, to stand by his friend's side, a man of action now reduced to a patient. Eliza took his hand, her touch surprisingly firm and grounding. "Elias, you did what you had to do. You asked for help. That's not a sign of weakness, that's a sign of a strong man who knows his limits and is wise enough to ask for help when he needs it. And Miller, he's a good man. He'll know what to do. You have to believe in him, just like he believes in you. Her words were a powerful balm to his soul. They were not just a comfort, they were a call to action. She had given him a purpose again, a reason to fight, to heal. He wasn't just healing for himself, he was healing so he could be ready to stand with his friend when the time came, to be a man of action once more. That night Elias slept more soundly than he had in weeks. The weight on his shoulders had lessened, replaced by a quiet sense of hope and resolve. He dreamt of a reunion, of a horse safe and sound, and of a handshake between two old friends who had found each other again in a world that had tried its best to tear them apart. The four riders moved like silent shadows through the cool, crisp night air, the stars their only guide in the vast, empty landscape. They had pushed their horses to their limits, driven by the urgency of their mission and the raw emotion of Miller's fury. As the first pale light of dawn broke, casting a cold, ethereal glow over the landscape, they reached the mouth of a narrow mountain pass. It was a treacherous stretch of land, a natural funnel with steep, unforgiving cliffs on either side, a perfect place for an ambush. Miller pulled his horse to a halt, his hand raised as a signal for his men to stop. His eyes, sharp and practiced, scanned the rocky terrain. "This is it," he said, his voice a low, tactical whisper. "If they're heading for the mountains, they have to come through here. There's no other way." Corporal Thomas, the most experienced tracker among them, dismounted and knelt, his face grim as he examined the ground with a trained eye. "They've been here, sir. Tracks are fresh, maybe an hour or two ahead of us." He pointed to a small, dark pile of dung. "This is from the horse, the roan." Miller's heart sank, a knot of frustration and fear tightening in his gut. They were so close, yet they were still a step behind. He saw the tracks of the four riders leading into the pass. He knew it was a terrible gamble to follow them in, a risky move that could get them all killed, but he also knew they had no choice. Ben would expect them to give up or take a safer, longer route. They would have to be unpredictable, to use their smaller size and greater speed to their advantage. "We go in," Miller said, his voice firm, his resolve unshakable. "We stay low. We listen. Don't make a sound." They rode into the pass, the silence of the canyons amplifying the slightest sound. Every rustle of a tumbleweed, every fall of a small rock sent a jolt of tension through them. Miller, a veteran of countless ambushes in a war long past, had a sixth sense for danger. He felt it now, a prickling on the back of his neck, a cold, foreboding feeling in his gut that screamed of a trap. As they rounded a sharp bend, they saw them, a small campfire, its embers still glowing like a malevolent eye, with three men sleeping around it, their rifles propped up beside them. The fourth, Ben, was standing guard, his back to them, looking out at the valley below, a careless arrogance in his posture. Whiskey, the roan, was tied to a nearby rock, its head low, its body trembling slightly, a poignant and heartbreaking image of a defeated spirit. The horse was painfully thin, its wounds from the beating not tended to, a stark testament to the cruelty of its new masters. Miller raised a hand, a silent signal to his men to dismount. They moved silently, like ghosts, their boots making no sound on the rocky ground. They took cover behind a large boulder, their rifles raised, their hearts pounding in their chests. "They're not expecting us," Miller whispered, his voice a low, urgent hum. "Johnson, you take the one on the left. Thomas, the one on the right. I'll get Ben. Lee, you cover the horse. No shots unless absolutely necessary. This has to be a surprise." The plan was simple and terrifyingly risky. They would have to be silent, to take them out before they even knew what hit them. Miller raised his hand, a final silent signal to his men to move. They advanced, their movements slow and deliberate, their rifles aimed at the sleeping figures. Then a small loose stone, dislodged by Lee's boot, rolled down the hill with a loud mocking clatter. Ben's head whipped around, his eyes wide with surprise and a flash of animalistic fear. He saw them, the four figures in the dim light of dawn, their rifles raised. "Ambush!" he screamed, his hand flying to his pistol. The camp exploded into chaos. Johnson's shot went wide as the man he was aiming for scrambled to his feet. Thomas's aim was true, the man on the right going down with a groan. Miller fired at Ben, but the man had already dived for cover, his survival instincts taking over. Lee, in the confusion, was trying to get to the horse, but another outlaw was already on his feet, firing at him with a brutal efficiency. The pass became a cacophony of gunfire, the sound echoing off the canyon walls like 1,000 cannons. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and the shouts of angry men. Miller fired at Ben, who was returning fire from behind a rock. He could hear the terrifying thud of bullets hitting the rock near his head, a sound he hadn't heard in years. Then a cry. Lee. A sharp, pained cry. Miller's head whipped around. The young private was on the ground, clutching his arm, a bright stain of red spreading across his sleeve. The other outlaw, seeing his advantage, ran toward the horses, scrambling to get away. Miller's heart sank. They had lost the element of surprise. The mission had gone from a quiet rescue to a chaotic fight for their lives. He knew with a terrible, sinking certainty that the pass had become a trap, and they were the ones caught in it. The firefight in the pass was a maelstrom of chaos, a brutal reminder of the thin line between order and lawlessness. Miller, pinned down by Ben's relentless fire, had to make a decision, and he had to make it now. He could not risk his men's lives for a horse, no matter how much it meant to him or to Elias. He was a commander, and his men came first. He saw Private Lee, still on the ground, his face pale with pain and shock. "Thomas! Johnson! Pull back! Get Lee and get out of here!" Miller roared, his voice a command that cut through the noise of the battle, a sound of absolute authority. Thomas and Johnson, seasoned soldiers who had faced much worse, didn't hesitate. They provided expert cover fire, their shots forcing Ben to stay behind his rock, cursing furiously. Thomas grabbed Lee, helping him to his feet, and they began to retreat, their movements quick and practiced, a well-rehearsed dance of survival. Miller kept firing, providing a distraction, a human shield for his men. He knew he couldn't hold them off for long. Ben was a cunning enemy, and he would realize soon enough that he was the only one left. Miller saw the two other outlaws, the one who had shot Lee and the other who was now on his feet, scrambling to get to their horses. He fired a shot at the horse of the man who had shot Lee, the bullet hitting the animal in the flank. The horse reared, whinnying in pain and terror, throwing the outlaw to the ground in a cloud of dust. He wouldn't be getting away so easily. Ben, seeing his men falling back and one of his horses down, emerged from behind his rock, a wild look in his eyes. He fired at Miller, a shot that grazed his arm, the burning pain a sharp reminder of the danger. Miller returned fire, his bullet hitting the rock where Ben had been moments before. Miller knew he had done all he could. His men were safe, and they had managed to wound one of the outlaws, delaying their escape. He gave one last look at Whiskey, who was watching the chaos with wide, terrified eyes. The horse was a symbol, a living, breathing promise to Elias, and he couldn't break that promise. He would be back for him. He turned and ran, following the path his men had taken. The sounds of gunfire slowly faded behind him as he joined his unit, who were now a safe distance away. Lee, his arm bandaged with a makeshift tourniquet, was still pale, but he was lucid. "Sir, I'm sorry," he said, his voice a low apology, his shame palpable. "I messed up. We lost the element of surprise." "You did your job, son," Miller said, his voice gruff but kind. He clapped Lee on the uninjured shoulder. "You're alive, that's all that matters. You did what you were trained to do, now let's get you to a doctor." As they rode away, Miller's mind was racing. The element of surprise was gone. Ben now knew he was being hunted, and he would be even more dangerous. But they had not lost. They had retreated to regroup to plan a new strategy. He knew Ben would not expect them to come back, not so soon. He would expect them to get a larger force, to ride back to the outpost for reinforcements. That's exactly what Miller didn't do. He had a small elite force. They were fast and they were loyal. He would use their size as an advantage. They would be a ghost, a silent predator, and they would hunt Ben and his men until they had nowhere left to run. He knew the land, and he knew how to read a man. Ben was driven by greed and a twisted sense of revenge. He wouldn't give up on the horse. He would take it to the nearest town to sell it, a small outpost in the hills, a place known for its lawlessness and its disregard for the law. "We're not going back," Miller said, his voice firm, a new resolve in his eyes. "We're going to the town of redemption. We'll beat them there. We'll be waiting for them." The men looked at each other, their faces filled with a new resolve. They were a small band, but they were bound by a purpose, a sense of honor that transcended their small numbers. They were no longer just soldiers on a mission. They were men on a quest for justice, and they would not fail. The town of redemption was a fitting name for a place that seemed to have none. It was a collection of dilapidated shacks and saloons, a haven for outlaws and drifters who sought to escape the long arm of the law. The law was non-existent, and the only rule was that might made right. It was a place where Ben would feel safe, a place where he could sell the horse without fear of repercussions, a place where no one would ask any questions. Miller and his men, traveling with the wounded Lee, made a detour, a long and arduous ride through a hidden valley, a shortcut that only a seasoned rider with an intimate knowledge of the land would know. They pushed their horses hard, knowing that every minute counted. They had to beat Ben to the town, to be there waiting for him, a silent and unseen predator. As they rode, Miller's mind was on Elias, his old friend, and the promise he had made. He thought of the war, the countless lives lost, the brutal, senseless sacrifices made. He thought of the horse, a living embodiment of that sacrifice, a reminder of a time when honor and duty were all that mattered. He knew that if they failed, the horse would be sold, its fate sealed. It would be a symbol of a world where cruelty and greed triumphed over kindness and compassion, a world where men like Ben could win. He couldn't let that happen. They arrived in redemption, just as the sun was setting, the dusty town bathed in a golden, eerie light that cast long, dramatic shadows. They found a small, discreet livery where they tended to their horses, making sure they were fed and watered. Lee's arm was still in pain, a deep, throbbing ache, but he was a soldier, and he insisted on staying with them, on being a part of the mission. Miller, seeing the determination in his eyes, didn't argue. He knew that the boy's sense of duty was more important than his physical pain. "We'll find a doctor for you here, son," Miller said, his voice low and reassuring. "But first, we wait." They found a quiet corner in a saloon, a place where they could observe without drawing attention. They ordered some drinks, their eyes constantly scanning the street, their hands never far from their pistols. The saloon was filled with the usual rabble of outlaws and gamblers, their faces etched with a kind of weary desperation that came from a life on the run. Hours passed. The night deepened and the moon, a sliver of silver, rose in the sky. The town was quiet, but a sense of tension hung in the air, a feeling of an impending storm. Miller and his men were a silent, watchful presence, their hands constantly ready, their senses heightened to the slightest sound. Then, a sound, the unmistakable sound of hoofbeats, a small group of riders approaching the town. Miller's heart began to pound in his chest, a drumbeat of anticipation and adrenaline. This was it. He looked at his men, his eyes holding a silent command that was understood without a word. "Get ready," he whispered, his voice a low, urgent hum. "This is for Elias. This is for the horse. Let's make this right." They rose from their seats, their movement so quick and silent that no one in the saloon even noticed them. They moved to the back of the saloon, to a small alleyway that gave them a clear and unobstructed view of the street. The riders came into view, Ben on a large black horse with two of his men riding beside him, and behind them, a rope tied around its neck, was Whiskey, the roan. The horse looked exhausted, its head low, its body trembling with every step, a painful image of defeat. Miller's hand clenched into a fist, a cold fury rising within him. He saw the way Ben was treating the animal, a complete lack of respect or care. He saw the cruelty in his eyes, a cruelty that reminded him of the darkest days of the war. He raised his rifle, his eyes sighting down the barrel. He had a clear shot at Ben, but he wasn't here to kill, he was here to make a point. He was here to get the horse back, and to show that honor still had a place in the unforgiving West. He took a deep breath, his finger tightening on the trigger. The time for waiting was over. The time for action had come. The dusty main street of redemption, usually a cacophony of saloon-goers and rowdy voices, was eerily quiet under the cloak of night. Only the distant tinny sound of a piano and the rhythmic approaching clip-clop of hooves broke the stillness. Miller, a man of profound patience and honed instincts, was crouched low in the shadows of a narrow alleyway. He felt his heart pound in a steady, urgent rhythm, perfectly synchronized with the approaching riders. He had a clear shot, a perfect line of sight, but he knew that a single bullet would only serve to enrage them, not stop them. He needed to be smarter than them, to use the one thing they didn't have, the element of surprise. He whispered to his men, a low, urgent command that barely carried on the wind. "Wait for my signal. We hit them fast and hard. They won't see us coming." Then, a sight that made the cold fury in his stomach burn hotter than ever. Ben, a swaggering bully on horseback, rode into the center of the street, flanked by his two remaining men. And behind them, tied by a cruel-looking rope, was the roan, Whiskey. The horse was a shadow of its former self. Its head was low, its once proud stance broken, a profound limp making its every step a testament to suffering. Miller felt a fresh wave of white-hot rage. This wasn't about a stolen horse anymore. It was about honor, about justice, and about the brutal, senseless cruelty of men like Ben. Ben dismounted, a cocky swagger in his step that grated on Miller's nerves. He was so sure of himself, so arrogant in his victory. "Go get us some whiskey, boys," he said with a coarse laugh, handing the rope to one of his men. "I'm going to find a buyer for this worthless beast." As the two outlaws began to lead the horse toward the livery, Miller saw his chance. The split-second distraction, the moment of vulnerability, was all he needed. "Now!" he shouted, his voice a command that shattered the stillness of the night. A barrage of shots rang out from the alleyway, not aimed at the men, but at the ground around their feet. Dust and rocks exploded into the air, a shocking, blinding cloud that forced the men to jump back in a panicked reflex. Ben, caught completely off guard, fumbled for his pistol, his bravado instantly replaced by a panicked terror. "Drop your weapons," Miller commanded, stepping out of the shadows, his rifle aimed squarely at Ben's chest. His men, a tight, disciplined formation, were right behind him, their guns trained on the two outlaws who were frozen in a state of shock and disbelief. Ben, a flicker of pure panic in his eyes, slowly raised his hands. "What is this?" he snarled, his voice a low, venomous growl. "You're trespassing, soldier. You have no right to interfere." "This isn't trespassing," Miller said, his voice cold and steady, as if he were simply stating a fact. "This is justice, and that horse belongs to a man you left for dead, a man who happens to be my friend." The two outlaws, seeing the odds stacked against them, slowly dropped their rifles. But Ben, ever the defiant one, was not so easily subdued. He looked at Miller, a sneer on his face, his pride refusing to be broken. "You and what army, old man? There's just 4 of you against 3 of us. We can take you." "That's all we need," Miller replied, a quiet confidence in his voice that was far more intimidating than any shouted threat. Ben, seeing a glimmer of opportunity in Miller's seeming overconfidence, made a fatal mistake. He lunged for his pistol, a desperate move that was over before it began. Miller, a man of quick reflexes and steady hands, fired a single shot, not at Ben's head, but at his shoulder. The bullet hit its mark with a sickening thud, and Ben cried out in pain, his pistol clattering to the ground as he crumpled to his knees. The sound of the shot drew a crowd from the saloon, a motley group of curious onlookers. Miller didn't flinch. He walked over to Ben, his boot pressing down on the outlaw's injured hand, a look of ice-cold authority on his face. "That was your one warning," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Next time I won't miss." Thomas and Johnson moved quickly, their movements a well-rehearsed dance of practiced efficiency. They disarmed the 2 other outlaws and tied their hands behind their backs, their faces a mask of professional calm. Private Lee, despite the pain from his wound, managed to take the rope from the outlaw and gently lead Whiskey away from the chaos, a look of profound relief on his face. The crowd watched, silent and stunned. Miller was not a man to be trifled with. His presence, his authority, was a stark and powerful contrast to the lawlessness of the town. He turned to the crowd, his gaze sweeping across their faces, a silent warning in his eyes. "This man and his gang," he said, his voice ringing with authority, "assaulted a good man and stole his horse. They're going to face justice, and if any of you try to stop us, you'll face the same fate." No one moved. No one spoke. The unspoken law of the West was that you didn't interfere in a man's business, and Miller had made it very clear that this was his business. Miller and his men quickly secured their prisoners. They tied Ben and his men to their horses and began to ride out of town, the silent, watchful crowd their only audience. As they rode, Miller looked back at the town of redemption. The name, he thought, now had a new and powerful meaning. They had come to this lawless place and had found a form of justice, a glimmer of hope. The chase was over, but the journey was just beginning. They had the horse, and they had the outlaws. Now they had to get back to Elias, and to a new beginning for all of them. The road ahead would be long and hard, but for the first time in a long time, Miller felt a sense of purpose, a sense of hope. The war may have ended, but the fight for what was right was just beginning. The ride back to Elias's ranch was a long and arduous one, a slow, painful procession through the desolate landscape. Ben, a man filled with a simmering, venomous rage, was a constant source of trouble. His insults, his threats, and his low, guttural curses were a constant hum in the air, a testament to his humiliation and his bruised pride. The two other outlaws, Jeb and Silas, were silent, their fear a palpable thing that hung in the air like a thick fog. They knew they were at Miller's mercy, and they knew that mercy in the lawless West often meant a quick, brutal death. They were just men, and they had gambled everything and lost. Miller, ever the stoic leader, ignored Ben's taunts. His focus was on the most important member of their party, the horse Whiskey. The roan was still weak, its limp more pronounced now that the adrenaline of the chase had worn off. Miller rode alongside the horse, his hand resting on its neck, a silent promise of protection and a source of quiet comfort. He gave Whiskey water from his own canteen, rationing it carefully, and shared his own food with the animal, making sure it got the nourishment it desperately needed. Private Lee, despite the throbbing pain in his arm, was a constant source of optimism and gentle care. He talked to the horse, his voice a soft, soothing tone. He spoke of the ranch, of Elias, and of the quiet, unwavering care the old man had given him. He was a young man, a boy really, but he had the heart of a soldier and a compassion that shone through his pain, a beacon of light in the grim procession. The journey was a slow one. Miller didn't push them, not with a wounded man and a weakened horse. They made camp at night, always keeping a watchful eye on their prisoners. Ben, ever the opportunist, tried to escape once, but Miller was too fast for him. A swift, professional punch to the jaw was all it took to remind him who was in charge, and to remind him that he was no longer the one in control. One evening, as they sat around the campfire, the silence broken only by the crackle of the flames, Ben, his face a bruised and swollen mask of hate, finally spoke. "You think you're so righteous, soldier?" he sneered, his voice a low, contemptuous whisper. "You think you're so different from us. You kill, you steal, you do what you have to do to survive. We're all the same. There's a difference between surviving and preying on the weak," Miller said, his voice quiet but firm, a stark contrast to Ben's venom. "There's a difference between a soldier and a scavenger. A soldier fights for a cause, for something bigger than himself. A scavenger takes what he wants and cares for nothing but his own gain. A soldier fights for a cause," Ben scoffed, a sneer on his lips. "And what's your cause? An old man and a worthless horse? Is that what you fight for?" "My cause is honor," Miller said, looking Ben straight in the eye, his gaze unwavering. "It's a cause you know nothing about. It's the reason I'm here. It's the reason you're a prisoner. And it's the reason that horse is still alive, because of honor." Ben had no response. The words, simple as they were, had hit their mark. He was a man without a cause, a man who lived only for himself. Miller, on the other hand, was a man with a purpose, a man who fought for something bigger than himself. The distinction was clear, and it was a defeat far more profound than any bullet. As the days turned into nights, the landscape began to change. The arid, unforgiving desert gave way to rolling hills, and then to the familiar, comforting sight of green pastures. The scent of dry sagebrush was replaced by the scent of fresh grass, and the air, once thick with dust, was now clean and cool. They were getting closer to Elias's ranch, and the tension in the air, the constant watchfulness, began to ease. Whiskey, sensing their destination, began to show signs of life. Its head, once so low, was now held a little higher. Its ears would twitch at the sound of a distant bird, and its steps, though still a little wobbly, were more confident. The horse, like a wounded soldier, was beginning to heal. Miller knew the journey wasn't just about getting the horse back. It was about proving a point. It was about showing that even in the lawless West, kindness and compassion were not signs of weakness. They were a sign of strength, a strength that was far more powerful than any gun or any threat. They were a small band of men, but they were bound by a common purpose, a shared sense of honor. They had faced down a gang of outlaws, and they had won. They were not just soldiers, they were redeemers, and they were on their way home. Elias, still at Eliza's cabin, was a man on edge. He spent his days staring at the horizon, a constant knot of worry in his stomach. He had sent his message, a desperate plea for help, and he had to trust that his old friend Miller would receive it and would understand the urgency of his words. But the wait was agonizing, an endless, torturous cycle of hope and despair. He felt a profound sense of guilt, a fear that he had put Miller and his men in harm's way, that his simple act of kindness would lead to the death of his friends. Eliza, seeing his anxiety, was a constant source of calm. She had tended to his physical wounds with a quiet, efficient grace, and now she was tending to his spirit, a much more difficult task. "He'll be all right, Elias," she would say, her voice a quiet reassurance, her hands gently working in her garden. "You know the man. He's a survivor. He's a man of purpose." Elias would nod, but the worry never truly left him. He would tell her stories of Miller, of his strength and his leadership, as if to convince himself that his friend was invincible. But deep down, he knew the truth. They were just men, and the West was a dangerous and unforgiving place. One afternoon, as the sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery colors, Elias was sitting on the porch when he saw a cloud of dust on the horizon. His heart leaped into his throat, a mix of hope and terror. He squinted, his old eyes straining to see. It was a group of riders, and as they drew closer, he saw the unmistakable uniforms of the cavalry. He rose from his chair, his hands trembling. He saw Miller at the head of the group, his face a grim mask of exhaustion, but his eyes held a look of profound recognition and relief. And then he saw the horse. The roan, whiskey, limping but alive, its head held a little higher than before. A wave of relief, so profound it almost brought him to his knees, washed over him, a powerful emotion that erased all of his previous worry. Miller and his men dismounted, their faces tired but resolute. Ben and his men were tied to their horses, their heads bowed in defeat, their defiance completely broken. Miller walked toward Elias, his hand outstretched, a gesture of profound respect and camaraderie. "Elias," he said, his voice rough with emotion, a single word that carried the weight of their shared history. Elias, unable to speak, simply took his hand. It was a handshake between two men who had been through hell and back, a silent understanding of a debt repaid and a loyalty reaffirmed. Elias looked at the outlaws, and then at Whiskey, and then back at Miller, his eyes filled with a mix of awe and gratitude. You did it," he whispered, the words barely audible. "You really did it." "We did," Miller said, a faint smile on his lips. "But you're the one who started it, old friend. You're the one who had the courage to fight for what was right, to stand up for a helpless animal." Elias walked over to Whiskey, his hand gently stroking the horse's neck. The horse whinnied softly, a low rumbling sound of recognition and comfort. It nudged its head against Elias's hand, a silent, "Thank you." Eliza, who had watched the whole scene from the doorway, came out and walked over to Miller. "I'm a doctor," she said, her tone all business. "Your man's arm needs looking at. It looks like it's infected." Miller nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "He's a good man," he said, gesturing to Private Lee. "He's the one who found the horse." While Eliza tended to Lee's wound, Elias and Miller sat on the porch, a quiet understanding passing between them. Elias told him about the attack, about the beating, about the fear that had gripped him. Miller, in turn, told him about the long, grueling chase, about the ambush in Redemption, and about the small but significant victory they had won. "You knew I'd come," Miller said, a statement, not a question. You had faith in me." "I knew," Elias said, a profound sense of peace settling over him. "I knew you were a man of honor. I knew you'd never abandon a comrade, not after everything we've been through." The words hung in the air, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they shared. They were two old soldiers, their lives forever intertwined by a war that was long over, and a new battle they had just won. The sun, a fiery orb in the sky, cast long dramatic shadows across the land, but the darkness had lifted. The world, for the first time in a long time, felt a little brighter, a little more just. The next morning the sun rose over a different kind of world. The outlaws, tied to a sturdy post near Elias's cabin, were a grim and powerful reminder of the darkness that had descended on the ranch. Ben, his face a bruised and swollen mess, glared at Miller with a venomous hatred that still burned in his eyes. The two other outlaws were quiet, their eyes filled with a desperate, palpable fear. They had lost everything, and they knew it. Miller, a man of quiet authority and unwavering conviction, was not a man to rush to judgment. He knew the law in the West was often a brutal, quick thing, but he also knew that he was a man of the law, a man who believed in justice, not in vengeance. He and Elias, his old friend, talked at length about what to do with the outlaws, their conversation a careful, measured debate. "We can't just let them go," Elias said, his voice firm and unwavering. "They'll just come back and do it again. They'll just come back and bring more friends." "No," Miller agreed, a grim expression on his face. "We can't. But we won't hang them either. That's not who we are. That's not the justice we stand for." They decided on a different kind of punishment, one that was fitting for a group of men who had preyed on a good man and a defenseless animal. They would be stripped of their horses and their dignity. They would be marched on foot for 100 miles to the nearest cavalry outpost. They would be handed over to the authorities, and they would face the law for their crimes. It was a long, humiliating journey, a punishment that was far more effective and soul-crushing than a quick, painless death. It was a punishment that would force them to confront their actions with every painful step. As they began the long march, their hands bound, their heads bowed, Miller walked alongside them, his rifle slung over his shoulder, a constant, watchful presence. Ben, still defiant despite his injuries, tried to make one last show of defiance. "You think you're going to make us walk 100 miles?" he sneered, his voice hoarse with pain. "We'll just die out here. You're a fool if you think we can make it." "You're not going to die," Miller said, his voice calm and steady, a profound conviction in his words. "You're going to suffer. You're going to think about what you did with every painful step you take. And you're going to learn that in this world there is still justice. There is still a price to pay for your actions, and it's a price that can't be bought with a few shots and a stolen horse." The words hit their mark with a chilling precision. The look of defiance on Ben's face was replaced by a look of dawning horror. He realized that this was not a quick, painless end. This was a long, arduous journey, a constant physical reminder of his defeat, a punishment that was far worse than any bullet. The two other outlaws, seeing the grim reality of their situation, simply bowed their heads. They had been bested, not by a stronger force, but by a force of a different kind, a force of honor, of unwavering resolve, of a moral high ground they had never known. As they began their long, slow walk, Elias and Eliza stood on the porch watching them go, a profound sense of peace settling over them. The sun beat down on the desert, a relentless, fiery orb in the sky. But the air, for the first time in a long time, felt a little lighter, a little more just. "You did the right thing," Eliza said, her hand resting on Elias's arm, her voice filled with a quiet pride. "You showed them that you can't just take what you want and expect to get away with it." Elias nodded, his gaze fixed on the disappearing figures, their silhouettes growing smaller with every passing minute. "It's a long walk," he said. "A very long walk." "It is," Eliza agreed, "but it's a walk of justice, and that's all that matters. They'll never forget what happened here, and neither will we." The land, once so full of a silent, foreboding menace, now felt like a place of hope. The outlaws were gone, but the lesson they had left behind, the lesson of compassion and of courage, was a lesson that would live on. The West was a dangerous place, but it was also a place where a man could stand up for what was right, and a place where a man could find a little bit of redemption. With the outlaws gone, a profound and absolute sense of peace settled over Elias's ranch, a peace that was deeper and more meaningful than any he had ever known. The air, which had been thick with tension and the lingering scent of fear and violence, now felt light, free, and utterly breathable. The silence that had once been a heavy, oppressive thing, a constant reminder of his loneliness, was now a quiet comfort, a welcome reprieve after the storm. It was a silence filled with the gentle hum of nature and the soft, steady rhythm of life returning to normal. Elias and Eliza, their days finally free from the constant, gnawing threat of danger, were able to turn their attention fully to the quiet, methodical business of healing. Elias's physical wounds were mending, and with the help of Eliza's expertly prepared herbal remedies, he was slowly but surely regaining his strength, his body knitting itself back together. But more than that, his spirit was mending. The defeat he had felt, the shame of being so easily overpowered, was now replaced by a quiet triumph. The battle had been won, not with brute force, but with courage and the unwavering loyalty of his friends. And whiskey, the roan, was mending too, a mirror of Elias's own recovery. Elias, with a quiet, almost overwhelming joy, spent his days tending to the horse. He carefully cleaned its wounds, applied the same soothing poultices Eliza had given him, and fed it a steady diet of the richest oats and hay he had. But beyond the physical care, he spent his days simply being with the animal. He would talk to it in a low, soothing murmur, his voice a gentle hum in the quiet barn, telling it stories of his life, his past, and his dreams for the future. He spoke of the peaceful life they would live together, the endless fields they would ride, and the quiet comfort they would share. The horse, in turn, began to respond in a way that spoke volumes. Its spirit, once so broken and defeated, was slowly, almost imperceptibly returning. Its head, once held low in a posture of resignation and despair, was now held high, its ears pricked, its eyes bright with a newfound light. It would follow Elias around the ranch like a silent, loyal companion, a living shadow that was a constant source of comfort. The bond between them, a bond forged in hardship and compassion, was now stronger than ever, a powerful testament to the healing power of kindness. Just a few days later, Miller and his men, having delivered their prisoners to the authorities, returned to the ranch. They were tired and dirty, their clothes stained with dust and sweat, but they were also a family. They had been through hell and back together, and their loyalty to each other was a palpable thing, a deep, unspoken understanding that transcended rank or title. They spent a few days at the ranch, resting and recuperating from the long, arduous journey. Private Lee's arm was mending beautifully, and his spirits were high. He would spend hours with whiskey, his youthful enthusiasm a refreshing contrast to the quiet solemnity of the older men, his laughter echoing across the fields. One evening, as they sat around the campfire, the stars a silent, distant audience, a moment of profound understanding passed between Miller and Elias. "I'm going to put in a good word for you, old friend," Miller said, his voice low, "for your courage, for what you did. What you did here will not go unnoticed. It won't be forgotten." Elias smiled, a gentle, genuine smile that lit up his face. "No need, Miller. I didn't do it for a medal. I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because it was the right thing to do, that's all." "I know," Miller said, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames of the fire. "But some things need to be recognized. Some things need to be remembered, not just for you, but for the world, to show that there are still men who would stand up for what's right even when it's hard." He was right. The story of Elias and the horse was not just a story of a single act of kindness. It was a story of a man who, in a world of violence and lawlessness, had chosen compassion over cruelty. It was a story of an old soldier who, in a world that had tried to break him, had chosen to fight for what he believed in. As they sat around the campfire, the vast empty landscape stretched out around them, but Elias no longer felt alone. He had his ranch, his horse, and his friends. He had found a purpose, a new purpose that had been born out of an act of kindness. The West, a place that had seemed so empty and unforgiving, now felt like a place of hope. It was a place where a man could find redemption, not just for himself, but for the world around him. And that, he realized, was a victory far greater than any war he had ever fought. As the days turned into weeks, life at Elias's ranch settled into a new, peaceful rhythm that felt both familiar and profoundly different. The old routines were back: the mending of fences, the tending of crops, the quiet solitude of the open land. But they were no longer a lonely, solitary existence. The isolation that had once defined his life was now replaced by the quiet, constant companionship of Eliza, who had decided to stay on the ranch. Her presence, a perfect blend of quiet, calm, and practical nature, was a welcome and essential addition. Elias, in turn, found a new sense of purpose in her company, his days filled with a new kind of quiet joy that he had never known before. He was no longer just surviving. He was truly living. The cavalry men, having rested and recuperated from their long journey, were finally ready to return to their outpost. As they prepared to leave, Miller, his face a mask of serious consideration, pulled Elias aside for a private conversation. "I'm leaving a couple of men here for a while," he said, his voice low and firm. "Just to keep an eye on things. Ben has friends, and he's not a man who gives up easily. He's an animal, and animals like that will always come back to what they think is theirs." Elias nodded, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. He knew Miller was right. Ben's defeat was not the end. It was just a beginning. He was a man who held a grudge, a man whose pride had been deeply wounded, and he would not rest until he had his revenge. The two men Miller left behind were Corporal Thomas and Private Johnson, two of his most trusted and capable soldiers. They were a silent, watchful presence on the ranch, their movements practiced and efficient. They helped with the daily chores, mending fences and tending to the horses, their quiet dedication a constant reminder of the unwavering protection of the cavalry. Their presence gave Elias a profound sense of security, a feeling of safety he hadn't experienced in years. As the days passed, a new routine began to form, a comfortable and productive rhythm. Elias would work the land, his movements slow but steady, while Thomas and Johnson would work alongside him, their efficiency a perfect complement to his experience. Eliza would tend to her garden, her hands a miracle of healing and growth, the small vibrant patch of color a symbol of the new life taking root on the ranch. And Whiskey, the roan, was a constant presence, its strength returning with every passing day, its movements more powerful and graceful than before. The horse was no longer just a horse, it was a symbol. It was a symbol of hope, of resilience, of a quiet victory. It was a living, breathing reminder that even in the darkest of times, an act of kindness could be a powerful thing, a spark that could ignite a fire of change. One evening, as they sat around the campfire, a sense of quiet contentment filled the air. Elias looked at Miller, a question in his eyes. "What will happen to them?" he asked, his voice low. "Ben and his men." "They'll face justice," Miller said, his voice unwavering. "They'll be tried, and they'll be punished. And after that, who knows? The West is a big place, and the law can only do so much, but they'll carry the mark of this defeat with them for the rest of their lives." "And what about you?" Elias asked, a genuine curiosity in his voice. "You're a man who's used to fighting. You're a soldier. What do you do now that the war is over?" Miller smiled, a rare, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I'll go back to my unit. I'll go back to my duty. But I'll carry this with me. The knowledge that in a world of violence and chaos, there is still room for honor. The knowledge that a single act of compassion can be a powerful thing, more powerful than any bullet, more powerful than any army." He was right. The story of Elias and the horse was not just a story of a single act of kindness. It was a story of a man who, in a world of violence and lawlessness, had chosen compassion. It was a story of a man who, in a world that had tried to break him, had chosen to fight for what he believed in. And as the sun set over the horizon, painting the sky in fiery colors, Elias felt a profound sense of peace. He had his ranch, he had his horse, and he had his friends. He was no longer alone. He had a purpose, a new purpose, that had been born out of an act of kindness. The West, a place that had seemed so empty and unforgiving, now felt like a place of hope. It was a place where a man could find redemption, not just for himself, but for the world around him. Weeks turned into a full month, and life at Elias's ranch settled into a comfortable and productive routine. The days were filled with hard work and a quiet sense of purpose. Elias, with the tireless help of Thomas and Johnson, had not only rebuilt his fences, but had strengthened them, creating a more secure perimeter for his property. His crops, thanks to a few timely and generous rain showers, were flourishing, their green shoots a testament to the new life taking root on the ranch. And Whiskey was completely healed, its coat shiny and its spirit full of life. It would gallop across the fields, its movements a graceful dance of pure freedom, a stark contrast to the broken, defeated creature Elias had found just weeks before. The horse was a constant, living reminder of what was possible when a man had the courage to act. Eliza, now a permanent fixture on the ranch, had set up a small medical clinic in a corner of the barn. Her reputation for quiet competence and healing hands spread quickly through the sparse homesteads of the area. People from nearby ranches, having heard of her skills, would come to her for help with everything from minor injuries to nagging ailments. The ranch, once a place of deep isolation and solitude, had become a small but vibrant hub of community, a place where people could not only find a little bit of healing, but also a little bit of hope. But even in this newfound peace, a quiet, insidious sense of unease lingered in the air. A shadow loomed in the distance, a silent, unspoken threat that everyone knew was still out there. Ben had been a man of pure vengeance, and men like him didn't forget a defeat, especially one so public and humiliating. The memory of his face, contorted with hatred and shame, was a constant, unspoken fear that hung in the air. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long, dramatic shadows across the land, a lone rider approached the ranch. Thomas, ever vigilant, had his rifle raised before the rider was even close enough to be clearly seen, his gaze fixed on the approaching figure. The rider, a young boy on a tired-looking horse, raised his hands in surrender as he drew closer, his eyes wide with fear. "I have a message," he said, his voice trembling, "from a man named Ben." Elias and Thomas exchanged a worried, knowing look. They had been expecting this. The boy handed a folded piece of paper to Elias, his eyes wide with fear, and then quickly rode away, as if running from a ghost. The message was short and chillingly to the point. "How you may have won the first round, old man, but the fight ain't over. I'm coming back for what's mine. I'm coming for the horse. And I'm bringing friends. A lot of friends." The note was unsigned, but the threat was clear and unmistakable. Ben was back, and he was not alone. Thomas immediately sent the boy back to his home with a warning, then rode to the nearest telegraph office as fast as he could to send a message to Miller. The peace was over. The fight was on again. Elias, his hands shaking, reread the note, the words a cold dread that settled deep in his stomach. He had hoped for a life of peace, a life free from the violence of the past. But the past, it seemed, was not so easily left behind. He looked at Whiskey, who was grazing peacefully in the pasture, and he knew he couldn't let Ben win. He had saved the horse once, and he would not hesitate to do it again, no matter the cost. That night, Elias, Thomas, Johnson, and Eliza gathered around the campfire, their faces grim and set. The old soldier in Elias was back, his mind already racing, planning, and strategizing. "He won't come alone," Thomas said, his voice low and serious. "He'll bring more men. He'll want to make a statement. He'll want to prove that he's still a force to be reckoned with." "Then we'll have to be ready for them," Elias said, his voice firm and unwavering. "We'll have to use this place to our advantage. We'll have to turn this ranch into a fortress. We'll have to fight with everything we've got." They spent the next few days preparing for the inevitable. They built more barricades, they dug trenches, and they stockpiled ammunition, turning the peaceful ranch into a fortified stronghold. Eliza, with her quiet strength and unwavering determination, was a constant source of support. Her hands, once so gentle and focused on healing, were now firm and determined as she helped with the preparations. She was no longer just a doctor, she was a fighter, a guardian of the home she had found. The ranch, once a place of quiet solitude, had become a battlefield. The scent of dry sagebrush was replaced by the scent of gun oil and sweat. The peaceful silence was replaced by the sound of hammers and shovels. They were a small force, a handful of men and a woman against a gang of outlaws. But they were bound by a common purpose, a shared sense of honor, and a deep, abiding loyalty to each other. They were not just a group of people, they were a family, and they would fight to the death to protect their home and their hope. The small beige envelope containing the telegram felt impossibly heavy in Miller's hand. The words, short and brutally direct, were seared into his mind. Ben is back. Bringing friends. Need help. Elias. The very simplicity of the message spoke volumes. Elias, a man of quiet self-reliance and profound dignity, would never have sent such a plea unless the situation was dire. Miller's heart sank, a cold dread settling in his stomach. He had hoped against hope that their initial intervention would have been enough to quell Ben's vengeful spirit. He had wanted to believe that the justice they had served would have taught Ben a lesson, that it had been enough to deter him. But Miller was a realist, and he knew men like Ben. They were dogs with a bone, consumed by a venomous, all-consuming spite. This was no longer a simple matter of a personal vendetta. It had escalated. Ben's note, threatening to bring a lot of friends, meant this was a full-scale assault on a civilian's property, a crime that demanded a swift and decisive response from the law. With a grim, resolute expression, Miller strode from his office and found his sergeant, a man named Henderson, who had served under him for years and understood his every unspoken command. The sergeant saw the look on Miller's face and knew without a word that the peace they had so carefully built was now in jeopardy. "Sergeant," Miller said, his voice low and firm, cutting through the usual bustle of the outpost. "Get the men ready. We're riding out at first light. We're going back to Elias's ranch." The words were an order, but they were also a statement of unwavering loyalty. Henderson didn't ask questions. He simply saluted, his face a grim mirror of Miller's own determination, and left to prepare the unit. The word spread like wildfire through the outpost, a ripple of quiet urgency that replaced the usual camaraderie. The men, having heard the legendary story of Elias and the horse from Thomas and Johnson, were not just ready, but eager to help. This wasn't just another patrol or a standard mission. It was a matter of honor, a chance to defend a man whose quiet courage had resonated deeply with them all. A palpable sense of quiet resolve settled over the outpost. They were not just soldiers in a uniform. They were redeemers, men who believed in justice and in the profound power of a single act of kindness to change the course of events. They knew the journey would be long and hard, the battle ahead uncertain, but they were ready. They were a force of purpose, a small, disciplined band of men standing against a lawless world of violence, and in their hearts they had no doubt they would not fail. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, a different kind of preparation was underway. Elias and his small group, Eliza, Thomas, and Johnson, were a tiny island of order in a vast, unpredictable sea of chaos. They had done everything they could, fortified the ranch with barricades of stacked logs and makeshift trenches, and stockpiled ammunition. They had a plan, but they were still outnumbered, perhaps by as much as 10 to 1. It was a daunting reality, and they knew they were facing a battle they might not win. The atmosphere was thick with an unspoken dread, a tangible fear of the unknown. Elias, looking at the determined faces of his small group, felt a profound sense of pride that outweighed his fear. He had come to the West to escape the echoes of the war, to find a life of peace and quiet. But he had found something far more important instead. He had found a new kind of war, a war for what was right, and in doing so he had found a new kind of family to fight it with. He looked at Eliza, her face grim but resolute, her hands now clutching a rifle instead of a medical bag. He looked at Thomas and Johnson, their hands steady on their rifles, their quiet loyalty a constant reassurance. And he looked at Whiskey, the roan, standing in the pasture, its head held high, its eyes filled with a quiet courage that mirrored his own. He was not alone. He was a part of something bigger than himself, a part of a fight that was far more important than any war he had ever fought. He knew that the outcome of the battle was uncertain, a toss of the dice on a cosmic scale. But he also knew with a fierce certainty that came from the depths of his soul that they would not surrender. They would fight to the death to protect their home, their hope, and their honor. As the sun set over the horizon, a fiery orb in the sky, the ranch, a small but defiant beacon of hope in the vast empty landscape, was ready for the fight. The days that followed were a long, tense waiting game. The silence was not peaceful, but a thick, heavy thing, a palpable absence of sound before the inevitable storm. Elias and his small group kept a constant watch, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of a dust cloud, any hint of an approaching shadow. Their senses were heightened to the slightest sound, the rustle of a tumbleweed, the distant cry of a hawk, a sound that could be a bird, or it could be a scout. The air, once so serene, was now thick with anticipation, a constant hum of nervous energy. They ate in silence, their conversations short and to the point, each man and woman lost in their own thoughts of the battle to come. They slept in shifts, their dreams filled with the ghosts of the past and the fear of the future. The ranch, once a sanctuary of solitude, had become a cage, a place of confinement, a place of constant, unspoken dread. Elias, in his quiet moments, would often walk to the pasture and look at Whiskey, the roan. The horse's strength and spirit were a constant source of inspiration. The horse, a living symbol of everything they were fighting for, would look back at him, a silent understanding passing between them. They were two old survivors, their lives forever intertwined by a war that was long over, and a new battle they were about to face. Elias would gently stroke the horse's neck, a silent promise that he would protect it no matter the cost. Meanwhile, Ben, having gathered his men, was making his way toward the ranch with a terrifying speed and purpose. He was a man consumed by a single, all-encompassing purpose: vengeance. He had been humiliated, defeated not by a superior force, but by a moral one, and he would not rest until he had his revenge. He had found more men who were just as lawless, just as desperate, and just as cruel as he was. He had painted a false picture for them, promising them riches and power, the reward of taking a ranch from a helpless old man. He had promised them the horse, and he had promised them a share of the spoils, stoking their greed and their hatred. He rode at the head of the group, a look of cold fury etched on his face. He was not just a man on a mission, he was a man on a warpath, a force of nature driven by a relentless desire for revenge. He would show Elias and the cavalry that you don't mess with a man like him. He would show them that in the West, the law was a fragile, fleeting thing, and a man's will was the only law that truly mattered. He saw this as a final test of his own power, a chance to prove his dominance once and for all. As they rode, the land, once so vast and empty, seemed to shrink around them, the horizon, once so distant, now getting closer with every thundering hoofbeat. They were a force of destruction, a dark shadow that was about to descend on a small beacon of hope. Ben, in his rare moments of quiet, would think of the horse, the roan. It was more than just a horse to him. It was a symbol of his defeat, a symbol of his humiliation. He would not just take the horse, he would destroy it. He would sell its hide, a final, brutal act of defiance. He would show the world that in the end, a man's honor was worth nothing more than a piece of leather, a worthless, pathetic thing that could be discarded and sold. The sun set over the horizon, painting the sky in fiery colors, a fitting backdrop for the coming battle. The ranch, a small light in the growing darkness, was a beacon of defiance. Ben and his men were a dark storm on the horizon, a force of destruction that was about to descend. The battle was about to begin, and the fate of a man, a horse, and a small beacon of hope hung in the balance. The stage was set, the players were in place, and the final act was about to begin. The sun, a searing disk of white-hot fire on the horizon, cast long, dramatic shadows as Ben and his gang finally arrived. They were a motley crew of some 30 men, their faces a brutal mix of desperation and malice, their ragged clothes and worn-out gear a testament to their hard, lawless lives. Their numbers were a stark and terrifying contrast to the small, determined group defending the ranch. They surrounded the property like a pack of wolves, a grim, silent army waiting for the signal to attack. Ben, riding at the head, dismounted with a swagger that belied the cold fury in his eyes, and strode forward, a sneer on his face. "Elias!" he roared, his voice echoing across the quiet land, a sound of pure, unadulterated hatred. "Come out, and bring the horse with you. You can't win this, old man. You're outnumbered and outgunned. Don't make this any harder than it has to be." Elias, standing behind a barricade of stacked logs that he and his small team had so painstakingly built, raised his rifle, the weapon feeling both impossibly heavy and reassuringly familiar in his hands. "Ben," he called back, his voice steady, his old soldier's training kicking in. "This ranch is my home, this horse is my family. You're not getting either one of them. You should have learned your lesson the first time. Leave now, and you and your men can ride away with your lives." A cold, humorless laugh escaped Ben's lips, a bitter sound that carried on the wind. "Family? That's what you call a worthless piece of meat? A symbol of a war we lost? You got a choice, Elias. Give me the horse and I'll let you live. Refuse, and you'll all die in a fire." "My friends and I," Elias said, his eyes scanning the faces of the surrounding outlaws, "will not surrender to a man who has no honor." The last word, a simple, profound challenge, hung in the air, a silent defiance that enraged Ben more than any bullet could have. Ben's face contorted with pure, unadulterated rage. He turned to his men, his voice a low growl of a wounded animal. "Don't just stand there, burn it down, and when that old man comes out, put a bullet in his head. Leave nothing but dust and ash behind." The outlaws advanced, their faces a mask of cruel determination. They carried torches, their flames a hungry, flickering menace that seemed to dance with the setting sun. They moved toward the barn, the stables, and the ranch house, intent on fulfilling their leader's command and reducing the ranch to rubble. But Elias and his group were ready. As the first outlaws approached, a barrage of gunfire erupted from the hidden barricades. The shots were not aimed at the men, but at the ground. A strategic warning shot that exploded dust and rocks in their faces, making them stumble and halt. The outlaws hesitated, surprised by the fierce, organized resistance. They had expected an easy win, not a fight. Ben, enraged by their hesitation, screamed at them to keep going. "They're just 4 men! Rush them! What are you waiting for, a damn invitation?" The outlaws, emboldened by their numbers and terrified of Ben's fury, surged forward once more. But Elias and his men were seasoned veterans. They knew how to fight. They fired at the ground again, forcing the outlaws to scatter in confusion. Then, with a practiced precision, they aimed at the riders' horses, the most vulnerable target. The horses, a few of them hit, reared in terror, whinnying in pain and fear. The outlaws were thrown to the ground in a chaotic, tangled mess of limbs and dust, their numbers' advantage rendered useless. The battle had truly begun. The quiet, peaceful ranch was now a battlefield, the air thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the shouts of angry, desperate men. Elias, his hands steady on his rifle, was a different man. The old soldier in him, the one who had seen and survived countless battles, had returned. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a commander, and his home was his fortress, a place he would defend with his life. He fought with a fierce determination, his movements precise and deliberate. He and his men moved from barricade to barricade, their shots a constant, relentless reminder that they would not be easily defeated. Eliza, a pillar of quiet strength, was a constant presence, her hands tending to the wounded, her voice a calm reassurance in the midst of the storm. The outlaws, completely unprepared for such a fierce and organized resistance, were faltering. They had expected an easy victory, a quick, painless surrender. Instead, they were facing a battle of wills, a battle they were losing. Ben, in a fit of rage and desperation, dismounted and fired his pistol at Elias, the shot going wide. He had underestimated his opponent in every way, and he was beginning to realize the gravity of his mistake. But then, a new sound cut through the chaos, a distant, unmistakable sound of approaching hooves, a low, rumbling sound that grew louder and louder with every passing second. Ben's head whipped around, a flicker of pure panic in his eyes. He knew that sound. It was the sound of the cavalry. He was trapped, and for the first time in his life he was utterly, completely outnumbered. The sound of the approaching hooves was a wave of hope that washed over Elias and his small group, a tidal wave of salvation in the middle of a violent sea. They looked at each other, a shared sense of relief and resolute defiance in their eyes. They knew what was coming. The cavalry was here, and they had come to finish the fight, to bring an end to the reign of terror that had descended upon the ranch. Miller, riding at the head of his unit, saw the ranch in the distance. The sight was a chilling tableau of chaos and violence, the sound of gunfire, the frantic shouts. the dark figures of the outlaws. It was a sight he had seen 1,000 times before. He knew instinctively what he had to do. He raised his hand, a silent command to his men, and his voice, though not a shout, carried a weight that made his men sit up straighter in their saddles. "Form up!" The cavalrymen, a small but formidable force of disciplined soldiers, spread out into a classic V formation, a perfect battle tactic for a charge. They were a well-oiled machine, their movements precise and practiced, their every action a testament to years of training and a shared sense of purpose. They were no longer just soldiers on a mission. They were a force of justice, a beacon of order in a lawless world, and they were ready to fight for what was right. Ben and his men, caught between the fire of Elias's group and the approaching cavalry, panicked. They turned their attention from the ranch to the approaching cavalry, their faces a mix of fear and desperation. They were trapped, their escape routes cut off, and they knew it. "Hold them off!" Ben screamed, his voice a raw, desperate thing that had lost all of its previous authority. "Hold them off, and we'll make a run for it." But it was too late. The cavalry, a force of order and discipline, was an unstoppable machine. They charged, their voices a low, rumbling roar that struck terror into the hearts of the outlaws. The sound was a thing of primal fear, a sound that had struck fear into the hearts of countless enemies in countless wars. The outlaws, a disorganized rabble, were no match for the cavalry. The cavalrymen, their rifles held high, rode through the outlaws, their movements precise and deadly. They disarmed them, they captured them, and they showed them no mercy. The battle was over almost before it began, a decisive, final defeat for Ben's gang. Miller, his eyes scanning the chaos, saw Ben. The outlaw, his face a mask of pure desperation, was trying to make a run for it, scrambling toward a horse. Miller, a man of quiet authority, had a single purpose: to stop him. He rode after Ben, his horse a powerful, thundering beast that seemed to fly across the ground. He caught up to him in an instant, his hand reaching out and grabbing Ben's collar. He pulled him from his horse, throwing him to the ground in a brutal cloud of dust. "It's over, Ben," Miller said, his voice cold and steady, a final pronouncement. "You've lost. You have nowhere left to run." Ben, his face a grim, bruised mess, simply stared at him, a look of stunned defeat in his eyes. He had been so sure of his victory, so sure that he could take what he wanted. But he had been wrong. He had underestimated the power of a man's honor, the unwavering power of a man's resolve. Elias, watching the scene unfold, felt a profound sense of relief. The outlaws were defeated, their reign of terror over. The cavalry had come, and they had brought a sense of order to a chaotic, lawless world. He walked over to Miller, a quiet gratitude in his eyes. "You came," he said, his voice a low whisper, full of emotion. "You came for me." "I promised," Miller said, a faint smile on his lips, and a soldier always keeps his promises. The war was over, but the victory was a sweet one. It was a victory not just for Elias and his horse, but for a world that had almost forgotten what honor was. The quiet, settled dust of the battlefield was all that remained of the chaotic violence just moments before. A profound silence had fallen, broken only by the low murmurs of men and the occasional pained groan of a wounded outlaw. The battlefield was now a stage for a different kind of heroism, the quiet, methodical work of healing and restoration. The outlaws, a defeated, shambling mass, were being systematically disarmed and tied, their faces a mixture of shame, disbelief, and a stark, unadorned terror of what was to come. Ben, his spirit utterly broken by Miller's final, definitive action, was a hollow man, a ghost of his former arrogant self. His eyes, once burning with malice, were now vacant, staring at the ground as if searching for the pride he had so recklessly thrown away. He had lost everything, not just his freedom and his gang, but the very essence of his identity, built on a foundation of cruelty and self-interest. Miller, a man whose quiet authority had always been his most potent weapon, moved through the scene with the practiced grace of a battlefield commander. He was no longer leading a charge, but guiding a rescue. The cavalrymen, having secured the perimeter, transitioned seamlessly into their secondary roles as medics and caretakers. The battle may have been brief, but the brutality of the fight had left its mark. Wounded men from both sides were tended to, the shared experience of pain momentarily bridging the chasm between lawmen and lawbreakers. Eliza, her quiet strength and professional demeanor, a sharp contrast to the raw, male energy of the moment, was a constant, reassuring presence. Her hands, nimble and sure, moved like a miracle of healing. She cleaned wounds, set bones, and comforted the injured with a low, soothing murmur, a sound that carried more authority than any shouted command. She was the embodiment of the ranch's newfound purpose, a place not just of sanctuary but of true mending. Elias, his hands still trembling from the adrenaline that had coursed through his veins, walked slowly toward Whiskey. The horse, no longer a terrified animal caught in the crossfire, stood with its head held high, its eyes filled with a quiet courage that mirrored Elias's own. It was a shared sense of victory. Elias reached out a hand, his touch gentle as he stroked the horse's neck. There was a silent understanding between them, a promise of a peaceful life to come, of sun-drenched days and quiet pastures, a life far removed from the dust and the violence they had just survived. The horse, in turn, nudged its head against his chest, a silent, profound thank you. The cavalrymen, their duty done and a difficult fight won, were finally at peace. They gathered around a makeshift campfire, their faces weary, but etched with a deep satisfaction. They had not just fought a battle, they had defended a man, a horse, and a principle. They had stood for something bigger than themselves, a tangible victory against the creeping darkness of lawlessness. Their tired contentment was a testament to the profound value they placed on honor. They had witnessed firsthand how an act of kindness, a simple gesture of compassion, could ignite a fire of justice that burned brighter than any torch and fought harder than any gun. Miller, standing apart for a moment to survey the scene, was a changed man. He was no longer just a soldier dutifully following orders. He was a hero in the truest sense. His actions had been born not out of duty, but out of a deep personal conviction. He had ridden to the rescue of an old friend, a man who had been grievously wronged, and in doing so, he had defended the very idea of honor in a land that seemed to have forgotten it. His quiet, commanding presence, once a symbol of military might, was now a beacon of moral authority. He had proven unequivocally that in the lawless vacuum of the West, a man of honor could still make an indelible difference, that kindness was a strength, and that true courage lay in defending the defenseless. As the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple, a profound sense of peace settled over the ranch. The darkness of the past few days, the fear and the violence, had been lifted. Light had returned, not just in the fading sunbeams, but in the hearts of the people who had fought for it. The war was over, but the victory was sweet, a testament to the enduring power of compassion and integrity. It was a victory not just for Elias and his horse, but for the very soul of the West, a world that had teetered on the brink of forgetting what honor was. Elias and Miller, two old friends, finally sat together, their silent understanding a bond far stronger than any words. They had faced hell and returned, their shared history of sacrifice and loyalty solidifying their bond forever. They had fought a war for what was right, and they had won. The bitter memories of the past were now just a prelude to a future filled with hope, a promise of a peaceful life built on the foundations of courage and a quiet, unshakable dignity. The following morning, the ranch woke to a world reborn. The air was crisp and clean, the dust of the battle settled, and the silence was no longer tense but restorative. The outlaws, a defeated procession, were already gone, escorted by a detachment of Miller's men to face the long arm of the law. The wounded, both friends and foes, were being cared for by Eliza, her makeshift clinic a symbol of new beginnings. The air was filled not with the promise of violence, but with a palpable sense of peace and a future full of possibility. Miller and his men, having fulfilled their duty and secured the peace, were preparing for their own journey back to the outpost. Their horses were saddled, their gear packed, and their faces, though still tired, held a deep sense of accomplishment. They had come to the rescue of an old friend and a defenseless animal, and in doing so, they had reminded themselves and the world of the true meaning of their service. They had shown through their actions that in a lawless land a man of honor could still make an extraordinary difference, that the cavalry was not just a force of military might, but a guardian of justice and a protector of the innocent. As they prepared to leave, a quiet procession of goodbyes began. Elias, his movements still a little stiff but his spirit soaring, walked with Miller toward the stables. Miller's face, usually a mask of calm authority, held a rare, open expression of respect and emotion. "We're leaving now, old friend," he said, his voice a low, steady murmur. "But this isn't a final farewell. We'll be back. I'll make sure to ride through here from time to time, just to check on you and the ranch." Elias nodded, his heart full. He knew Miller's promise was not an empty platitude. It was a soldier's word, a bond of loyalty forged in fire, and a commitment that ran deeper than any official duty. He knew that the cavalry would not abandon him, that he would forever be under the quiet, watchful protection of a man he considered more than a friend, a brother in arms. "Thank you, Miller," Elias said, the words thick with emotion, "for everything you've done, for coming for me, for the horse, for putting a stop to it all." Miller met his gaze, a faint, genuine smile touching his lips. He gently clapped Elias on the shoulder. "Don't thank me, Elias," he said. "The credit is all yours. You're the one who had the courage to do what was right. You're the one who stood up for a helpless animal. You're the hero in this story, not me. I was just a man answering the call of an old friend." The words hung in the air, a quiet acknowledgement of the profound bond they shared. They were two old soldiers, their lives forever intertwined by a past war and a new battle they had just won. Their silent handshake, firm and resolute, spoke volumes of respect, loyalty, and an understanding that transcended words. It was a moment of true camaraderie, a testament to the idea that some bonds are unbreakable. As Miller and his men rode away, their silhouettes growing smaller against the vast empty canvas of the horizon, a cloud of dust rising behind them like a fading memory, Elias watched them go. He felt a profound sense of peace. He had his ranch, his beloved horse, and now a deep and enduring friendship that had been rekindled by an act of desperation and defiance. The world was still a dangerous place, filled with shadows and uncertainty, but he was no longer alone. He had found a purpose, a renewed sense of meaning that had been born out of a simple, profound act of kindness. The West, a place that had seemed so empty, so unforgiving, now felt like a land of endless promise. It was a place where a man could truly find redemption, not just for his own past mistakes, but for the very soul of the world around him. And that, he realized, was a victory far greater than any he had ever fought on a battlefield. It was a victory of the heart, a testament to the enduring power of human decency in the face of overwhelming odds. With the cavalry gone and the silence of the ranch restored, a new, peaceful rhythm settled in. The old routines returned, but they were no longer a lonely, solitary existence for Elias. The isolation that had once defined his life was now replaced by the gentle, constant companionship of Eliza, who had decided to make his ranch her home. Her quiet calm and practical nature were a welcome addition, a soothing balm to a life that had been so rough and unforgiving. Elias, in turn, found a new sense of purpose in her company, his days filled with a new kind of quiet joy. He was no longer just surviving, he was truly living. The ranch, once a secluded haven, had become a small hub of community. Word of the events, the brutal attack, the heroic defense, and the arrival of the cavalry spread far and wide. People from nearby homesteads, having heard of the events, would travel to the ranch to visit, their faces filled with a quiet respect and a touch of awe. They brought supplies, offered their help with the ongoing repairs, and most importantly, listened to Elias's stories. They were captivated by his tale of compassion and courage, their faces a mix of admiration and a rekindled belief in the goodness of humanity. The story of Elias and the horse was no longer just a local event. It was becoming a legend, a whispered tale of hope that traveled on the wind. And Whiskey, the roan, was the living, breathing embodiment of that legend. The horse was completely healed, its coat now a rich, gleaming roan, its spirit full of life and fire. It would gallop across the vast, open fields, its movements a graceful, powerful dance of freedom, a stark and beautiful contrast to the broken, defeated creature Elias had first found. Elias would often stand at the fence line, watching the horse run, a profound sense of gratitude in his heart. The horse had come into his life at a time of profound darkness, when he had almost given up hope, and it had given him a reason to live, a reason to fight. It had given him a purpose, a new purpose that was far more important than any war he had ever fought. The horse was a constant, living reminder of what was possible when a man chose compassion over cynicism. Elias had come to the West to escape the war, to find a life of peace and quiet solitude. But he had found something far more profound instead. He had found a new kind of war, a war for what was right, a battle to defend a simple act of decency. And in that war, he had found a new kind of family to fight it with. The unwavering loyalty of old friends and the quiet strength of new ones. He had found a new life, a life that was not defined by the scars of the past, but by the promise of a peaceful future. A future that was filled with love, with hope, and with the simple, profound joy of living. The ranch was no longer just a place to hide. It was a home, a sanctuary, and a testament to the enduring power of a single, heroic act of kindness. Years passed, and the story of Elias and the horse became a legend that transcended the dusty plains of the West. It was a story told around crackling campfires, in smoky saloons, and whispered from one generation to the next. It was a simple tale, but its message was profound. A story of a man who, in a world of violence and lawlessness, had chosen compassion. It was a story of a man who, in a world that had tried to break him, had chosen to fight for what he believed in, not with a gun, but with his heart. It was a legend that spoke to the very soul of the human spirit, a beacon of hope in a time of darkness. Elias, now an old man with a face full of deep, wise wrinkles, was a figure of profound respect and quiet admiration. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a patriarch, a symbol of honor and integrity. He had a family now, a living testament to the life he had built. Eliza, his wife, was the quiet anchor of his existence, her hands and heart a source of unending comfort. Their children, who had grown up on the ranch, knew the legend of their father and the horse by heart. The ranch was not just a home to them. It was a living monument to a life built on courage, dignity, and purpose. It was a place of peace, a place where the memory of a simple act of kindness was honored and cherished. And Whiskey, the roan, was a constant presence, a living embodiment of the legend. The horse was old now, its coat graying like a winter sky, its movements slow and deliberate, but its spirit was still full of life, its eyes filled with a quiet courage and a deep, abiding loyalty. It would often be found standing by Elias's side, a silent, devoted companion, a physical manifestation of a bond that had been forged in the fire of shared trauma and a shared victory. The cavalry, a small but formidable force, would visit the ranch from time to time. Miller, now a colonel, was a frequent visitor, his face a mix of respect and deep affection. He and Elias would sit together on the porch, two old men whose lives had been shaped by a war and a promise. Their conversations were full of long silences and short, meaningful sentences. They would talk of the past, of the war, and of the battle for the ranch. They would talk of a time when honor was not just a word, but a thing that mattered, a thing that was worth fighting for. Their bond, a silent, unspoken thing, was a testament to the enduring power of friendship and loyalty. The West, once a place of chaos and lawlessness, was slowly but surely changing. The railroads were coming, their steel tracks a sign of progress and civilization. The towns were growing, and the law was beginning to take hold, a slow but steady force of order. The world was becoming a more civilized place, a place where a man of honor could still make a difference, and a place where a story like Elias's could find a permanent place in the annals of history. Elias, a man who had seen the worst of humanity, the brutal violence, the casual cruelty, the deep-seated hatred, had also seen the very best. He had seen the quiet courage of a man who was willing to fight for what was right. He had seen the unwavering loyalty of a soldier who would never abandon a comrade. He had seen the profound, world-changing power of a single act of kindness. It was an act that had changed his life, the lives of his family, and the lives of a world that was in desperate need of a little bit of light. Elias lived a long, full, and peaceful life. He died in his sleep, his hand resting in the gentle, loving hand of his wife Eliza. His face was a mask of peaceful contentment, a testament to a life lived with honor and purpose. He was buried on his ranch, a place of peace and a place of hope, a sanctuary that he had built with his own 2 hands and defended with his own quiet courage. His grave, marked by a simple stone, overlooked the vast open fields where he and his horse had found a new life. And Whiskey, the roan, lived on for a few more years. The horse, now an old, dignified creature, was a living monument to a man who had saved its life. It would often be found standing by Elias's grave, its head bowed in a silent tribute, a symbol of a deep, unspoken bond. It was a poignant and powerful sight, a living testament to a man who had given a broken creature a new purpose, a man who had taught it that even in a world of violence there was still room for kindness. The ranch, now in the hands of Elias's children, became a place of peace and of hope, a living legacy. The children, and their children after them, continued to tell the story of their patriarch, the man who had fought for a horse and in doing so had found his own humanity. It was a story that taught a simple but profound lesson, that a man's honor is not to be measured by his strength, but by the size of his heart. It was a story of a man who had found his own redemption in a world that had seemed to have forgotten the meaning of the word. And the legend of Elias and the horse lived on, carried on the wind and whispered from one generation to the next. It was a story that resonated with the very soul of the American West, a beacon of light in a land that was still filled with darkness. It was a testament to the power of a single act of kindness, an act that had set off a chain of events that had changed everything. It was a story that reminded a world full of cynical, weary souls that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not with a gun, but with a simple, unwavering commitment to what is right. It was a final, beautiful ride into a life of peace, a life of honor, and a legacy that would endure for generations to come, the end.